Welcome into another educational episode. We're your host, Drew and Drew. So Drew Sarton.
Should be easy to remember.
We try to keep it easy for everyone.
Right.
So Drew Sarton and I'm Drew Jones. We have the pleasure of being on the educational committee for the International Wine and Food Society Birmingham, Alabama chapter. And today we're going to talk about something that is incredibly important in the wine world as you are trying to shop and find wine. And that is, what on earth are you looking at when you pick up a bottle? That is a question that we get asked very frequently, especially when we're working in stores trying to help people find things. Maybe it's for, they want to take something fun to a wedding. Maybe it's just a party. Maybe it's, I'm cooking a big steak tonight and I need to know what I want. So whatever the case may be, the first thing that you have to figure out is, what do you want? And a very close second is, how do you then find what you want?
Right.
And if you don't know how to read the label, you can't really do that.
Right.
So we're going to talk about that. And we have a couple of examples. We're going to talk about some what we can see, what we see in France. In a couple of regions. We're going to talk about Germany. We're going to talk about Champagne, again going back to France. And we're going to talk about kind of an oddball, maybe an outlier, as it were.
Right.
And actually, I'll tell you what, we're just going to swap these because we'll hit all the French stuff together. But we'll talk about that outlier because when we get to that, we're going to be talking about America.
Right.
And I'm not sure if anybody knows this, but we kind of do our own thing here when it comes to alcohol laws, and you can kind of do whatever here. And we'll
Within
talk
reason, yeah.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But
the three main things you need to know with what kind of labels we're talking about, and Drew will talk about it with the French, but there's three different ones, and you can see it on the thing right now on the screen. It's how are you talking about the wine label? Is it based upon varietal, which in the case of the German wine, we'll see is it being labeled Riesling. A lot of California wines are also labeled varietally, and that's what we have come to be used to. Is it regional? And that's what very much France, Italy, and Spain are built around, so that you don't ever really see, at least on the front label especially, what the varietals are in that wine, but you know the region, and therefore, based on the region, will determine what kind of select varietals the winemaker can play with,
Right.
sometimes by law, sometimes by tradition, sometimes a combination of both. And then with the last wine, is it just a named wine? For instance, you don't see a varietal, you don't see a region. Sometimes there might be like Columbia Valley from Washington on there, but that is not going to give you an indication of what that wine is. It's really more of, okay, now I have to investigate the back label or look it up on Google.
yeah, and certainly like that would, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but we think of, let's think about some of the cult wines out of California. If we talk about, from 100 Acre, we talk about, some of those wines. I mean, they're, 100 Acre may be the winery, but there's different names. Or we talk about Colgan, right? So you talk about Cariad or Colgan 9,
Right.
or you talk about Screaming Eagle. You kind of have to do that research to figure it out. And there's a lot of leeway there because for a lot of reasons, I mean, sometimes it's those varietals and blends may change every year. Sometimes they just don't want people to know. It's a proprietary thing, and they don't want people to know.
And typically, what you are seeing is with those kind of non-regional, non-varietal wines, they are going to be blends. It's not like somebody's
Right.
going to have 100% cab and not label it as such on the wine.
Right.
Maybe, but very rarely. And again, it's probably because if that is the case, they've kind of gotten to some kind of cult status to where they don't have to tell you it's Cabernet. You just know it's Cabernet.
Mm-hmm.
But again, most of the time, you're going to have that listed.
Yeah, and I think that and we take that mentality again and kind of juxtapose to somewhere like France, where when you talk about Bordeaux or Burgundy, you're expected to know what varietals are allowed in that region. If you're talking Burgundy, we're not talking about Petit Verdot.
Right.
Likewise, if we're in Bordeaux, we're not talking about Pinot Noir. So you're expected to kind of have that baseline education level on your own. Certainly if we look at, Northern Italy, I think is a really good example in the Piedmont. When we look at, the Piemonte as a whole, we've got really two prime time regions for red. If you talk about Barolo and Barbaresco, well, you're expected to know what the subtle differences are between the two, but guess what? Same grape. So that it gets really interesting, and and that's part of kind of the rabbit's hole you can go down in that regard. So,
and certain regions will have use of both labels. So Piedmont's a great example, whereas Barolo and Barbaresco are regional, like geographic areas that you need to know is Nebbiolo grape. Whereas in the same area of Piedmont, you would have wines labeled Dolcetto and Barbera, which are the varietal names of those
Exactly.
wines. So it's not necessarily like if you're in a region, you have to use that region if that's what you do. It can kind of vary. There's also a lot more, especially with some bigger producers in Burgundy and everywhere else, where their main market is the U.S. And so some of them have, kind of acquiesced and started putting the varietal Pinot Noir or Chardonnay on the label.
Right.
In some cases, usually those are kind of intro tier wines and less village level kind of selections. But you might see a French Louis Latour Burgundy Pinot Noir, for instance. And that's because their main audience is America, where a lot of people still don't know that Pinot Noir is the main grape of Burgundy, right?
Yeah.
Complexity, and because of some of that, especially for the American market, unfamiliarity with those regions. That's why the kind of pervasiveness of really cute labels has really elevated a lot of wines and wineries and categories to heights unknown, because we could deviate by law. We didn't have to put a certain type of tradition around our labels.
Right.
We could have, it's the Wild West here, we could have some really kind of kitschy labels that were maybe got you some information, but you were really selling on the eye appeal on the shelf or behind the bar. And again, a lot of wines have kind of become very, very popular from the initial, not just because of the taste, but because of that really well-designed, label.
Exactly. Where you're not necessarily looking at the label to gain knowledge and understanding of what's in the bottle,
Right.
but you're looking at the label because it was attractive to look at.
Look cool.
Yeah, and as many of you know, I have one foot in the wine world, one foot in the beer world, and it's interesting because that's manifested nowhere more clearly than kind of in the craft beer world as well, where it's 100% based off the label. And again, we see that a lot in the new world. New world regions seem to embrace that a lot more when it comes to wine. We look at Molly Duker is a phenomenal example of that.
Sure.
Some young punks, women who shoot, or what is it, girls that shoot their lunch, or women that shoot their lunch. Those wines,
and a lot of even traditional wineries remarketing themselves in Spain and even Italy. Some in France, they're a little bit more of a holdout, but there's definitely some at certain price points where you're like, oh, that's a really cute label, and it's French for sure. So there's market trends that will always affect labels, but when we're talking about the traditional labels, let's go ahead and start with the France.
Exactly.
We have two examples, Bordeaux and Burgundy, and we're going to throw on the screen kind of a Burgundy, and actually the one we have here. So you can look at that in more detail up close, but kind of showing you, a little bit more of what information you need to look for.
So we're going to move. We'll have the Burgundy label in just a minute, but wanted to start with Bordeaux because we're going to kind of move across west to east. Thank you. I was having trouble getting that out. We're going to go actually European west to east. So we're going to hit across France and then into Germany. So one thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that when we look at labels in Bordeaux, one of the biggest things to point out is we know that we're always going to have vintage, right? So that's great. We're always going to have a producer, whether it be a chateau. Usually, we see it called chateau in Bordeaux as opposed to domain in France or in Burgundy. Apologies. Excuse me. And then one thing that we'll always see is where the wine is from. In this case, Margaux. But the reason that I wanted to show Bordeaux and show two different labels is that something that is a little bit of a misnomer is. Anyone in Bordeaux is allowed to put things like Grand Vin de Bordeaux on their label. That doesn't mean that it necessarily equates to what we see in Burgundy with a Grand Cru vineyard. That just means that in the opinion of the winemaker, in the opinion of the chateau, that is their best wine that they are producing. We still see the name of the producer, we still see the vintage, but in this case, we see Au Médoc. So, as most of you know, that's not we have no first growths in that in what would be classified as Au Médoc. We do have first growths in Margaux. So it's just something to be aware of, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's indicative of quality if you see Grand Vin de Bordeaux versus a label that doesn't have that. When we're at a store, we're in a retail setting or a restaurant setting trying to figure out what to order, the highlight to me is that fundamentally, these are going to be two very different blends. This is going to be predominantly Merlot driven, whereas this Margaux is going to be predominantly Cabernet driven. So, again, understanding what can, in Bordeaux in particular, what can be on a label and how those terms are used is going to be extremely different from, let's say, the next region that we're going to go to, which is going to be Burgundy.
And Bordeaux is honestly probably in France the most difficult to really kind of be able to decipher what you're going to have in the bottle when just looking at a label, unless you do a little bit of research as well as just have some baseline knowledge. Because as he pointed out, in Bordeaux, as an entity, you're going to, with a red wine, you're going to be dealing with 5 different grapes, potentially. Now, depending on if it's left bank or right bank will depend on whether or not that wine is Cabernet driven or Merlot driven. In the rare occasion, maybe a Cab Franc driven wine. But that's when you need to know, okay, from what region of what Bordeaux will determine that blend. But only looking up the wine probably online, and if the winery is nice enough to tell you, well, you actually get to see what is exactly percentagely in that wine. That's a moving target year to year. Again, some will be Cab driven, but the percentage of Merlot, whether or not they add Malbec or a Petit Verdot or Cab Franc into that blend as well, is anybody's guess. There's just no way of knowing that unless you do like a deeper dive online. Whereas compared to Burgundy, no matter what village level you get from Burgundy, it's going to be Pinot Noir, and it's going to be 100%.
Yeah, if it's a red, it's Pinot.
Right.
If it's a white,
a lot
it's
easier.
Chardonnay.
Exactly.
We're going to move on to Burgundy. So again, we're kind of moving west to east here. So you'll notice that one that we're going to have on the screen is a little bit different vintage, but this is the Vincent Dauvissat. This is Chablis. So we see that on the label. Again, at the top, we do have the vintage. That's where they choose to put the vintage. There's nothing saying they have to put it up here. They can put it down here. But Vincent Dauvissat, Chablis. So we know what region we're in. Chablis is not in the Côte d'Or. It is a little bit northwest.
It's closer to Champagne than it is to the Côte d'Or. It's pretty north.
Right. But we do have... as most of you know, we do have, I think it's 21 Premier Cru vineyards, 5 Grand Cru vineyards, and then a lot of, just other Village level stuff. So this one in particular, we see that they clearly label it for us, Premier Cru, and we see most often in Burgundy in particular, if you see just Premier Cru, with no specific vineyard listed, then it could be a blend of several different Premier Cru vineyards. But if they list out the specific Premier Cru vineyard, that means that wine is all from that specific vineyard. So again, that's where we start to delineate a little bit more from, just Premier Cru could be a blend of any of the 21 parcels. If they list the specific one, it's going to be 100% from that site. Generally speaking, by and large, Burgundy is much more into being super, super site specific. Premier Cru versus Grand Cru versus Village level means a world of difference. And in the retail game, we're talking the difference of hundreds of dollars. So if they can list a single vineyard, and they will. Yeah. They absolutely will. And we see that, kind of echoed here. We have Domaine Dujac. You'll see here that the predominant thing listed, again, we have the producer at the bottom, we have the vintage. The predominant thing listed here is the vineyard itself. They choose to list Grand Cru for you, but you are expected to know that if the specific vineyard is Bonmar, that is a Grand Cru vineyard. So they do put Grand Cru on there, but again, that you would be expected to know that. You obviously know if you're buying Burgundy that that this is 100% Pinot Noir, just like the Dauvissat was 100% Chardonnay for Chablis. But you are expected to know this is 100% Pinot Noir, and you are expected to know that this vineyard is in fact a Grand Cru vineyard. So.
Champagne is very similar in the same type. It's going to list a city that you can kind of, again, if you want to think about it in a different way, a lot of times with French wines and Italian wines, if you ever use the Google Earth program where you put your address in and you see a picture of the earth and then it kind of just narrows down into where your street address is, that's what a French label is doing. I mean, you're knowing, okay, it's France, then it's Burgundy, then it's going to be Chablis, and then it's going to be this Premier Cru site and this vineyard within it, and you're just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And what you're trying to do is to really weed out and kind of highlight the difference between just a Chablis or just a Burgundy. You know, and there's that kind of site specificity that comes with, you know, the terroir and the rarity and the kind of the specialness of those. Moving into the German example, when what we call a varietally kind of labeled wine, this is what you typically see more often in, say, German wines, and for the most part, what you would see in, say, American wines as well, where there is a varietal listed. It's going to let you know if it's Riesling, and you know, the case of Germany, it could be different varietals, and of course in America it could be pretty much anything. But you're going to have the winemakers here, usually their seal. They're going to show you, in the case of Germany, underneath the vintage or somewhere near the vintage, you're going to see what the QBA level is and the quality level, but mainly what the residual sugar was in the ripeness of the grapes at the time of harvest. So Spätlese typically are going to be kind of on the sweeter level, but there can be dry style of Spätlese. Again, it's not what the finished wine dryness or sweetness level is, it was the ripeness at the time of harvest. If it is a dry wine, very typically in Germany you will see that listed on the label as either Trocken, which is Trocken, which just means dry, or sometimes if it's a more produced wine that goes to America, you might see it listed as dry. And then you're going to have the region within Germany, which will kind of give you an idea of potential sweetness levels, potential kind of different fruits that you might get, acidity levels, again, soil types being a major part of that. This one is from the Rheingau, from Schloss Vollrads. And, you know, all this, again, is kind of just trying to build a picture in your mind of where this is coming from, and with it, kind of why it's special. But this would be a good example of a varietally labeled wine. And then the last one, which you kind of see, again, with more, not necessarily cheaper wines or inexpensive wines, but you kind of see it in that realm, is more of a name-driven wine, less built around a region specific or even a varietal. So this is the Hess Select, and it's called the Trio. So this is a winemaker's blend out of California. It's really just telling you here that it's a red wine, it's a table wine from California. And again, there are several blends that would kind of be underneath this vein. Robert Sinskey Point of View, you know, is a great example. The Austin Hope Trianas, you know, they are good wines that aren't labeled in the front, at least, as a varietal wine. They usually are, if it is a region, it's not going to be something that you can tie down to a necessary like varietal like you can in Burgundy. So if they were to say Paso Robles, it could be Cab, it could be Zen, it could be Syrah. You just don't know until you either turn the back label around or have to look online. But it's usually, again, more to have a house style that usually is a blend that you can modify vintage to vintage depending on what the weather gives you, what grapes you have available that year. Typically, they're going to stay within a certain realm because they want to keep that tasting profile the same. But percentages of Zen or Cab or Syrah in a grape or in a wine may change to kind of suit their needs.
And what we mean by that is that, you know, for winemaker X with label name X, let's use this as an example, Trio, they may want that to be a very jammy, intense fruit, big red wine. Well, it's kind of secondary what the exact percentages may be because they're going for a particular house flavor, house aroma, house style. So as opposed to, you know, another winemaker may have his blend, you know, his proprietary red is called, fist, boxer fist or something, whatever, right? And maybe his thing is like, I'm just going for the most tannic thing that's going to punch you in the teeth, right? So the idea, again, being much more of, to Drew's point, a house style. We want the same flavor profile every year so that you're not going into a restaurant or a store saying, I want Trio from Hess Select that is 74% Cabernet and 13% Malbec. You just know you want Hess Select Trio because it's going to have a similar flavor profile, kind of year in and year out.
Yeah, year you're going to have the same thing.
Right.
Those are the three main types of labels that you'll pretty much see. I mean, obviously, labels that are just straight pictures and don't have anything written on them would be kind of in that same category of no name labeling. And again, sometimes it's as easy as turning around the label to find out any information you can. Sometimes you have to look online, and sometimes you can never find out. There are certain red blends that the winemaker just doesn't put out there, and you just know that it's their red, and that's it. So, and again, nothing wrong with those wines at all. It's just their choice to kind of be a little mysterious.
Yes, because even those range from $5 a bottle to $500 a bottle.
Definitely. So,
well, thank y'all for tuning in. Hope that you have some fun next time you're at a store or at a restaurant, reading and learning about labels as much as we do.
Yeah.
So, cheers.
Thanks.